feature creep, power creep, and once again I'm one short of the power of threes. But I guess that's what happens when you reject modernity and return to tradition. But let's go more in depth of what I'm talking about. When a game's in development, or if a game is constantly in development, like some indie trash on Steam Greenlight, or even though that's not a thing anymore, or an MMORPG game, is developers will face an issue. How to add more content without everything becoming either vastly unbalanced or far too bloated and easy to understand to be enjoyable, or even both. You see this issue in trading card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering, for example. I have a deck underneath my desk, my real one, not the one on screen, that I built a few years ago. If I took that to a tournament today, I would get absolutely destroyed. Harder than an emotionally manipulated Sheldon Cooper, 5 seconds away from referencing Wrath of Khan. This isn't good game design. It's lazy, simple-minded, and has no thought whatsoever put into the game's longevity. And the worst thing about it is that once it starts, you basically can't stop it. If you add something game-breakingly overpowered, you need to add something that can beat it. And then you need to add something that can beat the something. And something that can beat that something, and so on and so forth. But before we talk about how you can go about preventing it, let's talk about the history. Now, this started in the dark, ancient, and prehistoric time, with the release of Dungeons & Dragons Edition 1. As more and more books came out, adding new items, abilities, etc., both the players and the developers started to notice that the newer stuff was far, far better than the older stuff, much more powerful. Now, this was a new concept at the time. It didn't even get the name until much later. And then a couple of decades later, Magic the Gathering creators were worried about the exact same thing. How could they make the new cards worth buying if they couldn't be that much stronger than the earlier cards, because that would make the earlier cards obsolete, but if they weren't good enough, nobody would buy them? You see the issue. Magic the Gathering actually got around this by adding regulations to what cards you could and couldn't use in your decks during official tournaments. And this worked. It's not ideal, which I'll get to later, but it functioned. Okay, so now you know what it is and how it comes about, let's talk about how to prevent it. Now, this focuses on just video games, but a lot of it will apply to trading card games and tabletop RPGs as well, because there is quite a lot of overlap between tabletop RPGs and video games. But number one, and this is the easiest, either have the newer features just be less than or equal in terms of functionality as the old ones. 2. Slightly more effort. Give the older features comparative buffs to match the new additions, because power is relative. If everything is OP, nothing is. If everyone's super, then no one is. Remember that? Power creep is only an issue if there's obsolete crap that players can see as wasted potential that just bloats the experience. 3. Give new features a downside. 4. Keep your core gameplay loop simple enough to begin with that it's basically power creep proof. This isn't applicable everywhere, obviously, but I just wanted to have 4 to make up the rule of 3s that I broke earlier. Now, I'm going to give you some examples about the situations where the 4 solutions I gave earlier are viable and usable, if that makes sense. Okay. Number 1, and number 1 is still the easiest. When you add new content, make it so that the new abilities, weapons, cards, heroes, dog poo cannons, whatever, are at most as powerful as your current ones. Team Fortress 2 did this with a lot of its unlockable weapons. Like, the vast majority of them are mechanically only as viable as the stock weapons at most, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about later. 2. Buff everything else. Now, this should be pretty self-explanatory, but if you're making a game like Mordor, no idea if I pronounced that correctly, and let's say the only class you've made as of right now is a big heavy knight who hits slow and hard. Let's say his damage per second is 20, and you make a really speedy ninja who also hits fast and hard. An easy way to buff the knight to make them equal is to give him way more HP than the ninja, and also give him a lot more super armor so he isn't knocked back as easily. 3. Give new features a downside. Like, let's say you add vampires to your MMORPG, and they absolutely wipe the floor with normal players, as they should. I mentioned the unlockable weapons in Team Fortress 2 earlier. Almost all of them trade away damage for some kind of special ability. If we take the Uber Sword, for example, hitting an enemy will reward you with 25% of your Uber charge. But the downside to that is that you swing it 20% slower. It trades direct combat proficiency for something that can be strategized around. So, with our MMORPG example I mentioned earlier, you could add another class called Vampire Hunter, who's a pretty well-solid, all-round jack-of-all-trades, but when those fuckers are fighting a vampire, they will wipe the floor with them. Or you can add holy water and garlic items that players can use to protect themselves against them. The list goes on, like, you just have to be creative. Overall, making the experience deeper, making it more interesting, all of those buzzwords. 4. Design your game around a concept that's just immune to feature creep. Like, let's say your game revolves around rock, paper, scissors, or is a parkour game, or is based purely on reaction time, or doesn't involve any kind of stats that need to be manipulated to achieve balance to begin with. If you do this, and stick to your original intentions when you were designing it, then no matter what you add will be just as viable as what you originally did. Now, failing this, let's say you've ignored all of my advice, and now one new mechanic is absolutely dominating your game. Okay, what can you do about it? If you add more powerful stuff to negate it, you're back to square one. And if you nerf it, it's going to make everyone who spent time, effort, and maybe even money absolutely furious. So what can you possibly do to fix this? Well, now you have 2 options. 1. Completely restructure your gameplay around this never happening again. It's not just a nerf to attack people who use this new mechanic, because look at all this other stuff that was changed as well. It's basically a brand new, better game now. And then follow the first 4 steps I gave. 2. Buff everything else. Give almost everything else a revamp to make it viable and interesting again. Like, just so it fits in with this new meta that this one ability has caused. Again, power is relative. It's not OP if everything else is. Is this far too much effort than it should be? Yes, it is. Because power creep is dangerous and very powerful. So, if you fall victim to it, you're going to have to try really hard to undo the damage that it's caused. Or you could just say fuck it and just release more and more powerful shit until the game inevitably dies. Because you're a bad designer. Absolutely huge thanks to Kasti and Baby Kitschy for supporting me on Patreon. And huge thanks to you as well for watching this entire video. Haven't uploaded in a while and I seriously need to up the volume. Which I'll be sure to do, if I can think of any more ideas. See you later!